Good afternoon and welcome to the session today. Thank you for being patient with us and for allotting us the extra 10 minutes as you fixed some technical issues. Again, thank you very much for joining us and thank you for keeping us company for the many weeks we've had this web campaign running. The Know Better, Do Better campaign has been running since mid-May, and we've continued to have multiple conversations on human trafficking and having them in a different perspective, in a more inclusive perspective. And we're grateful for joining us and allowing us to continue hosting these, inviting and engaging you in these conversations. So as you've come to know, the conversation is facilitated thanks to HAT, which is the Awareness Against Human Trafficking, in partnership with Stop the Traffic Kenya, Tangazo University, and the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Secretariat. So we've been able to have all these conversations thanks to lively how far we've come. Today, being our final conversation, we've brought in two experts who will give us an in-depth, but not an in-depth analysis and understanding of the legal framework with regard to counter-trafficking in persons in Kenya. They have promised not to go too much into the jargon because we know that our target audience is the common member of the public. So we want you to come out of this legal class or this law class with an understanding, but we don't want to lose you with too much jargon. So without further ado, allow me to introduce my panelists. I'll start with Madam Veronica Mwangi. Good afternoon and welcome. Kindly introduce yourself.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm called Veronica Mwangi. I work with the Kenya National Commission for Human Rights. I serve there as a deputy director, and also I work closely on matters of reforms and accountability and migration. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'll also ask Mr. Radek to introduce himself. So, Radek.
Good afternoon. My name is Radek Malinowski. I'm a founder and CEO of HAT Kenya, the organization that focuses on eradicating human trafficking. I also lecture and engage in different activities related to irregular migration and studies of this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, my name is Michelle Koinange. I'm the coordinator of Stop the Traffic Kenya, and I'll be your moderator for today. Again, please feel free to put in all your questions, your remarks in the chat box, wherever you're watching us from. We have an amazing team behind the scenes and they'll get the questions to us, they'll get the feedback to us. So feel free to use the chat function on whatever platform you're joining. Again, we'll ensure that the conversation doesn't get too much into the jargon of it, especially with such a technical topic. So I'll start with an easy question. How would you define human trafficking from your perspective? From the legal perspective. So how does Kenya define human trafficking? I'll start with Radek this time.
Okay, well, we all know that the definition of human trafficking comes from the law, the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act 2010, which is now based on international law that is very long, very technical, and, well, frankly speaking, difficult to remember. I always like to remind that this is a law that had that approach that try to capture in details each aspect of the act. I like to use a bit simpler definition that tries to explain trafficking as a process that through the selected means engages people in exploitative way. And that's kind of like my private way of capturing the human trafficking. But it's true, if you want to use the definition, if you want to assess if we are dealing with human trafficking or not, then we need to use the law that is provided. Definition is provided in law. And well, I always believe that the tables that we use, the famous 2 tables, they always help. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Veronica, you are uniquely positioned with your legal background and also with the work that you do with the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights to give us a clearer definition or distinction between our understanding of human trafficking in general and trafficking when it comes to child trafficking or human trafficking with regard to other groups, not only at the over to you. Do we?
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Yes. So, Michelle, just to add
Is it my end? Radha, can you hear her?
No.
Sorry, something that follows aspects of human trafficking. You have a case of a child, the one who's been trafficked. When you want, often Radhika has alluded to, key things that you look when you want to identify if a child has been taken from one place to another for purposes of exploitation. The need for us to appreciate that. And Michelle, I remember you asked about the human rights connection with human trafficking. Is that the question?
Yes, yes.
Yes. So looking at the human rights connection when it comes to the human rights connection with human trafficking, we need and for that reason,
sorry for interrupting you, Veronica. Sorry for interrupting you.
You can't hear me?
No, you froze for a while. So could I kindly ask you to just answer the question again from the beginning so that we can hear you? Awesome. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Thank you for that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm using the phone, so I think the calls are also coming in. I'm so sorry. I have to bar them.
Okay.
I was saying the connection between human trafficking and human rights is number one. Human trafficking concerns human beings who are trafficked. And for that particular reason, you want to appreciate that the human beings have rights. And if you look at the Kenyan laws, the constitution provides for the different rights of human beings. These are entitlements that someone is born with, and the state is supposed to help realize them. And for this reason, when we speak about the human trafficking, you realize that the individuals who are involved in the trafficking, and especially the victims of trafficking, they suffer a lot of human rights violations. And that's why the connection can easily be found when it comes to aspects of human trafficking and human rights. I hope I'm clear.
Yes, you are clear. Part of my question was also the difference between child trafficking and the general conversation on human trafficking. You had also dropped off during that part of the answer.
Okay, I can answer that. So the difference between the general human trafficking of an adult and that of a child is number one. If you look at the different criteria that we are supposed to assess for us to identify whether someone has been trafficked or not, for an adult, we have something we call the act or the actions. And these actions can be either where you procure someone, you transport someone from one point to another, you procure someone, you recruit someone. Some of these are the different aspects. The law defines a lot of details or gives examples of aspects that qualify as actions. Then you have the second element that must be fulfilled to prove a case of human trafficking, and this is the means. And the means, this largely looks at how was this person taken from one level to another. Again, then you come to the aspect, the means, for instance, an example that I can give under the means is the transportation and so on and so forth, while the last element you look at is exploitation. And then the exploitation as the last aspect, we always consider the forms of exploitation. Did this person who was trafficked undergo a certain form of exploitation? It could be sexual exploitation, it could be cheap labor or labor exploitation, and even abduction, and even not abduction. Abduction is a means. It could be labor exploitation, sexual exploitation, or any other form of exploitation. Those are three things that you look when you are dealing with general human trafficking of an adult. But when it comes to a child, we agree that the laws in Kenya confirm that a child cannot enter into any contract or a child cannot consent to any form of obligation. And with this, then for us to really come in and narrow down on the child trafficking, you look at two things. You look at the fact that this child was taken from point A, either so we focus so much on the actions, and then you go to the exploitation. So for you to prove the case of a child who is trafficked, you don't need to prove whether this person was taken from point A to B because of fraudulent means and so on and so forth. Thank you. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you very much, Radek and Veronica, for your detailed answers to the questions. Based on your answers, I understand that, and I'm sure most of our audience understands that Kenya has a great legal system within the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act. Human trafficking is rarely looked at as just that, human trafficking. As Veronica mentioned, we have aspects of sexual exploitation, we have aspects of labor exploitation, and so on and so forth. So Radek, would you have any other, or give us some of the other legal frameworks that are looked at when addressing cases of human trafficking? Do you have some examples or some of the other legal provisions that Kenya has when dealing with cases of human trafficking in the country?
Well, of course, I mean, when we talk about the legal framework, when it comes to human trafficking, we have a number of tools, number of possibilities, and the law that we just mentioned is just one of them. First of all, the victim rights are protected through Constitution. I think we always have to start with this. The foundation of every law in Kenya, plus a number of other laws that can protect incidents that are accompanying the child trafficking or human trafficking, such as Victim Protection Act and so on. I think what is important is that when it comes to human trafficking, the act that was introduced in 2010 is the proper law, and it is a good practice to use this act, and I think still we have challenges with that. So often what is the key issue that law enforcement agencies, they have that tool and they will prefer to go the usual way, or they will prefer to use different tools from law, like for example penal code, and I think that is not what is a good practice. I believe that we would expect them to fully utilize the Counter-Trafficking in Persons
Act. Thank you very much. I see Veronica smiling, so I'm assuming she also has a few other laws to add on to that. So Veronica.
Thank you. I didn't have so many other laws to add, but just to say that the victims also are protected by virtue of Kenya having taken in or adopted some laws the African region as well as the international region. So most of the times I think we have heard of the different treaties, human rights treaties or conventions. These are laws at the global level, or rather international level and the regional level, which different member states commit to respect and to uphold. And in Kenya, for instance, if you look at our constitution, it does allow Kenya and all of us as Kenyans to ensure that not just Kenyans, every other person within Kenya, and that is including migrants, they have rights or human rights that accrue by virtue of some of these conventions that Kenya has done what we call ratified. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Veronica, you've walked right into that question. Could you give us a list of some of these laws that we have ratified and some that are actually relevant to our conversation today?
Thank you. Thank you. Without being too legalistic, I would try to just mention a few. Number one, I would start, of course, with our national level, because this again is where the basis of, or rather the foundation of application of some of these laws finds a home. So we start with the Constitution of Kenya, and the Constitution alone has a detailed Chapter 4, which provides for what we call human rights. And before even you go to Chapter 4, we have Article 2, that is Article 2 for non-lawyers, that does speak to the different provisions and empowers the application of regional and international conventions that Kenya has ratified. So allow me to then walk into the East Africa region. At the EAC level, East Africa Community level, we have the EAC Treaty, or the East Africa Community Treaty. It does speak to the different rights of the people within the East Africa community. Then, of course, you go to the African region, for instance. At the African level, I can speak to the Charter on Human and People's Rights. This is a sort of a human rights instrument, a human rights law that applies to all these African countries. Then, of course, you have the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. That, again, is a law that provides the different human rights for the children in Africa at large. Again, having borrowed largely from the international instruments, the UN Convention. So the UN stands for the United Nations. And the United Nations is a convening that brings in the United Nations Council Assembly, brings in the different member states where Kenya is a member as a state. And in this membership, there are different laws that are passed. And some of these laws that again also apply to us is, for instance, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. It has a lot of details about the children's rights. Then again, you have other conventions, like the conventions that, of course, prevents discrimination against women, the CEDAW. You have the Covenant on Civil Political Rights. And also you have the Convention Against Racial Discrimination. You have also Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, among others. So all these different laws have found a sitting in our laws, either through the Constitution. Of course, most of them have been have found a sitting in our Constitution, but also to the individual or respective what we call the statutes or acts of parliament. And I forgot to mention the Palermo Protocol. So some of these conventions at the international level and even regional level, they have something we call optional protocols. Optional protocols, again, sort of, they are like value addition to the parent, they are value addition documents to the parent law, if I can put it that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an informative session, especially the answers. Now, I'm sure some of the audience members have taken kind of like a bridge law class. They've understood protocols, they've understood optional protocols, and so on and so forth. So you've educated us heavily. Radek, when you were giving your answer on the Counter-Trafficking Persons Act specifically, you mentioned that we have some gaps in the implementation. Could you continue with that? Like, you walked into that question. So could you kindly share some of the other gaps that you've identified or you've experienced as a director of HAT within our Counter-Trafficking Persons Act?
Thank you. Well, you see, like when you look at the Act, it has been like 11 years since the Act was passed and gazetted. So, well, I think enough time for us to see the first effects and to see whether we are on the right track. Definitely, the Act makes a difference. Yeah, and maybe when we always start with gaps when we talk about the law. I like to always mention what are the changes that the law brought. So allow me to twist your question, because as much as we always focus on gaps, we must say one thing. I mean, the current counter-trafficking movement in Kenya is much better after the Act was introduced. That big difference that happened in Kenya when it comes to fighting human trafficking. And there are more chances that victims' rights are protected, and there are more chances that traffickers will be prosecuted. And this is because of the law. When you go back and you check what was happening before the law was introduced, or if you look into the countries that the law is still not existent or is not effective, you will see the difference. And I must say we need to appreciate that the Act indeed changed the current situation when it comes to human trafficking. But question is, what is the gap? I mean, now, first of all, to what extent the law protects the Kenyans against trafficking? Can we say that because of the law there are less people traffic, or can we say that because of the law trafficking is now more risky business than used to be in the past? In other words, people who engage in trafficking, they know they risk a lot. And can we say that do we protect the victims as the Act was hoping to do we provide a framework for protecting the victims? Frankly speaking, for those 3 questions, I'm not sure whether we can answer positively. And maybe Veronica can help us with that. She is from the government side, so she can be better positioned to defend the law.
Thank you. Veronica, you have been put on the spot by Radek, so I will not add on to his question. So over to you, Veronica.
I'm trying to be defensive a bit, but it's okay. I agree with what Radek has said. Sometimes I think we jump into the gaps in our laws and forget the good that the law has brought about. And I would want us to just just think through this. The Counter Trafficking in Persons Act in Kenya, that was a 2010 document, was enacted in 2010, operationalized properly in 2014. That is 4 years after. What does that tell us? Are we trying to say that between 2010 and backwards, maybe up to from 1990, 1980, we didn't have any incidences of human trafficking? Of course not. We had a lot of cases then. Unfortunately, it was never prioritized, and there was no framework to even sensitize the different actors. And in human rights language, you call them duty bearers. There was nothing to help people appreciate what is going on. Again, most of the prosecutors and the investigators were just relying so much on the penal code, that is the law that speaks about the different crimes in Kenya, without really appreciating the dynamic of human trafficking and that it's a transnational organized crime. So we start with the fact that at least 10 years, 11 years after, as Kenya, we can say we have made good progress. Number one, we have a law. Number two, we have what we call establishment of different institutions within the law that have been brought about. We have the Advisory Committee on Counter Trafficking in Persons. This is an advisory board that is supposed or that is tasked to help the Cabinet Secretary within the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection to ensure implementation of the Counter Trafficking in Persons Act. Then also we have a board of trustees that deals with that handles or that is supposed to manage a trust fund for victims of trafficking. This is very unique. And I think we also need to check on that. It's unique in that, at least even though in Kenya we have a Victims Protection Act, we also have Witness Protection Act. There is no other crime where you have a standalone trust fund. But for us in Kenya, the trust fund for victims of trafficking is a great win. Then now we come back to the question, are we there yet? I think my answer to the challenges in our laws in terms of implementing, we are not yet there. I think I will give an example of devolution. We are 10 years down with our devolution, and we are already asking for review of the laws and the rest. Again, different people, different perspectives. So can you imagine if you go back to look to make an assessment of our Counter Trafficking in Persons Act, you can only say so about 8 years. So you have a child of 8 years old that is maybe now joining class, I don't know, grade 3 or grade 2. Is that a child that you can talk of her or him as an adult? Of course, not yet. So we are not yet there. There are challenges, of course, when it comes to implementing our Counter Trafficking in Persons Act in Kenya. One, financing a lot. You cannot do so much awareness. There is no way you are able to really empower the different stakeholders to take up their mandates firmly and effectively without the necessary funds to first sensitize them about the law. Number two, the different actors. I think we have the investigators, we have a number of prosecutors, we have a number of judicial officers, and even the civil society organization and human rights defenders who do not, again, appreciate or they don't necessarily understand proper the impact of human trafficking cases and also the impact on human trafficking to a victim. So again, this is an area we need to invest in, because as long as we have midway awareness on this subject, we will never implement these laws properly, and we will not be able to say that we have effectively combated the fight against human trafficking. Then the other challenge, as I finalize, is the fact that when you look at the different the conversations going on, there is a feeling that sometimes even when you're speaking about human trafficking, sometimes people don't focus so much on the human trafficking as a criminal offense. People focus on the migrants involved, and they miss out big time, because when you start seeing this a migrant from Uganda, this a migrant from Nepal, this a migrant from Somali, this a migrant from another country, then you miss out, because trafficking happens not just to the so-called foreigners, it happens also to our own Kenyans here in Kenya. And just to finalize, Kenya has been said to be both a source, transit, and destination. That is to mean, when it comes to human trafficking, we have Kenyans who are being trafficked on a daily basis internally, that is within Kenya, from one county to another, one town to another, but also externally, that is from Kenya to another country. And similarly, we have the same situation happening to other persons from neighboring countries, and even from other countries, those we call abroad, coming in Kenya as persons who are trafficked. So the need for us to appreciate that when we are looking at the human trafficking aspect, we are not looking at the cases of migrants per se. We are looking at a reality of a trans-organized crime that can affect you, me, at any given point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Radek should put you on the spot again, because that was a very detailed answer. Based on what you've just shared, Veronica, sorry, before you leave, you've given the chronological order of what happened with regard to the Counter-Trafficking Persons Act. Would I be correct in saying that maybe the reason why the conversation on human trafficking is the reason why we still have it as a sexual offenses conversation within organizations that work with SGBV, we'll have it as a labor issue within for example, the National Employment Authority, and so on and so forth. Could the absence of harmonization be the reason why human trafficking is still looked at in a somewhat divided way? For example, recently in the dailies, there was a case of, I think, 500 Kenyans in India who will supposedly face charges when they get back to Kenya because of their situation as migrants and not their plight as victims of human trafficking. So is harmonization really the big gap that we're facing, Veronica? Could that be the biggest, the big, yeah?
Harmonization, yeah, it's part of the challenge we have, and even uncoordinated efforts. And I think that's why I would really say that I thank the organizers of this webinar, because it sort of helps us to come in as stakeholders and talk as one, but also appreciate our different approaches in terms of addressing and combating human trafficking. So yes, harmonization is a key gap, but the largest gap, again, is awareness. Awareness, because even if you can be well coordinated, but if you don't know what you are coordinated about, then that becomes a huge challenge. Thank you.
And thank you, Veronica. And a lot of times when we talk about awareness, we look at the community. We look at the community and enhance the capacity of community members, and forget that human trafficking is still as you've mentioned, relatively new in the country. So we still need to create awareness within criminal justice actors, for example, within with law enforcement, even at the grassroots level, so a local police officer, because we do tend to have these conversations, but with people at a higher level. So for example, DCI based in Nairobi, or so on and so forth. So I like the perspective your perspective on that, awareness should grow beyond the community members. Over to you, Radek. You've also worked and I'll go back to my previous question, worked in the industry for many years now. So what would, to you, what is our big when it comes to the implementation of the Counter-Trafficking Persons Act? What gap are we of the Counter-Trafficking Persons Act?
Okay, well, again, I understand when we still go back to the question of gaps, I mentioned those three areas. I would say when it comes to implementing on the Trafficking Persons Act, I would like to have a comfort of having first of all the law that is implemented and the law that is somehow has enough practice through the court system, you know. And my question would be, do we have that practice to evaluate it? Okay. I think sometimes, again, I would like Veronica to correct me, but I have sometimes feeling, remember I'm before I came to Kenya, but sometimes I have a feeling that in Kenya, we have that kind of way of sorting out problems. For example, we create a law, the law is perfect. Seriously, the counter-trafficking law in Kenya is really keeps international standards. But somehow, well, it becomes another policy that is not implemented. Nobody implements the law. Then a number of years passes, everybody gets frustrated with that the law not being implemented. And somebody says, okay, we need to change the problem. We need to change the situation. And what do? We introduce a new law, or we introduce a new change to the law. And we expect that will bring a change, you know, like so many people expected that, you know, the new constitution will just completely change our country as like a magic wand, you know, you twist and, but it's like you wake up the next day, the constitution was implemented and you have the same people around you know, nobody traveled and nobody came. We are the same. We are just having a new tool, new to implement it. And my big question is, do we have enough evidence to say that that law needs to be changed? Do we have enough practice, experience, practices that we can say, wow, what this is not working, that is working, let's change it? Or we are taking a shortcut? You know, we are not happy with the current level of implementation, so we say, let's change the law. To what extent that will guarantee the future implementation? I don't know. Maybe Veronica does.
Veronica, I believe Radek has decided you're on the hot seat today. So over to you again.
Wow, I am also smiling. I think I share the views of Radek, and I share the same views more so because I have also been in the field. And a lot of times you ask yourself, what exactly are we amending and why are we amending? And I'm one of those people who have really advocated for one, evidence-based change. Don't just change to fit in the phrasing or the phrases or the wording, such that then where you have the minister, you want to put cabinet secretary. I think that doesn't add, it does not really add any value. But if we are looking at the Counter Trafficking Act and asking ourselves, fine, this is a 2010 Act, but it was enacted prior to promulgation of the new constitution. And then ask ourselves, so what rights or what benefits have been brought about by the new constitution? Now, the old now, because how many years back? Almost a decade. So the 2010 constitution brought in a lot of benefits. And I think globally it has been praised. Kenyan constitution has been praised as one of the progressive constitution. Number one, because of its inclusivity when it comes to the Bill of Rights. I mean, initially, there are different freedoms and rights that were never protected in the previous constitution. But with the current 2010 constitution, you realize rights such as economic, social, cultural rights are already catered for. This constitution has also gone beyond to identify vulnerable groups. They are called special interest groups. It has also gone beyond to identify the different rights of persons who are either arrested, and even has also spoken to aspects that speak to the, for instance, social protection. And when you are dealing with the cases of human trafficking, you have victims of trafficking. Majority of them fall into some of these problems because they are going out genuinely to look for greener pastures. They are seeking socio-economic progression. And as they do so, they sometimes they fall prey to the hands of the traffickers who take advantage of them, who of course exploit them in the different means that we alluded to earlier. So if we are then looking at the Counter Trafficking Act, revision or amendment, versus then asking ourselves, what are the gaps? Of course, we feel the victims are not yet well addressed, or the rights of the victims are not taken in well in the current act. Then the question we ask ourselves is, how can we then come in and ride on the constitutional rights that are there, the provisions that are there to make our act better and to secure the victim of trafficking? how can we create mechanism of social protection, for instance, or economic empowerment for victims of trafficking who have been reintegrated back in the country? Those are the things we should be looking at. But if we are going to just look at the language, or it says minister and not cabinet secretary, then we will have lost our opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. But I hear you. Our focus sometimes is on the very tiny and non-consequential aspects of the law. Instead of looking at things like, for example, I know victims of human trafficking, for example, are protected from, they have immunity in case they're caught committing a crime while they're victims of human trafficking. But a lot of the times, people, as you mentioned earlier, don't have that awareness and will actually end up convicting, or these victims end up going through the criminal justice system and end up being convicted and so on and so forth. So I hear you. When it comes to amendment, or if it comes to reviewing, we should look at the harder, not the harder parts, but the more important parts of this conversation, the parts based on our implementation, the gaps we face during our implementation or trying to utilize this law. Since we're talking about legal frameworks, and I am grateful to be surrounded by lawyers today, I'll kind of put you on the spot again with regard to prosecution. We've had this act for a decade now, and our rate of prosecution, or rates of prosecution, have not, if you look at the statistics, they don't reflect the cases of human trafficking that have been addressed so far. Radek, do you have an opinion on why prosecution doesn't seem to be the way or the form of justice most people seek? Could it be our act? Could it be some like individual preference? What would you attribute this to?
Well, I mean, yes, the whole prosecution is a very complex process. It is a process that is initiated at different levels and has different actors, and small mistake by one of them actually will jeopardize the whole process. For example, it must be evidence-based, and it must have, it must keep the standards of criminal law, which obviously they are oriented to providing beyond reasonable doubt that the trafficker committed trafficking, and sometimes that is often difficult to prove. For me, I think the major problem that I have with prosecution is that, the major problem that I think is that it is not synchronized with protection, frankly speaking, and I think that's the reason why it's not working, and it will never work. Because who is a central person in the prosecution process? Well, we all, of course, will say a victim. Yeah, who is the person who was affected by trafficking process, who is going to provide evidence, and who is going to testify, and who is going to be somebody who's supposed to receive some form of justice. But I don't think so. That's how we see it here. I mean, like in our country, who's the central person in the prosecution? I think it is a trafficker. We want him to go to jail. And often the victim actually is somebody who disturbs the process. You know, he's supposed to testify, and he's supposed to go his own way. Yeah, and we call him once we need him. And I think there's a major problem. And often, and it's very sad, the prosecution goes against protection. And you have dilemma. Should I focus on victims' rights, or should I focus on putting the trafficker in jail? That dilemma should never happen. We should always, actually, good prosecution will support protection, but that's a theory. In practice, often you have to choose between protecting the victim and prosecuting of trafficking, and it's a very, very wrong choice if you have to make it. Okay. Can we also ask questions? Because I have a question to Veronica. Yeah. Just to make it a bit more lively. There's one question. If you have a power to change, but only one thing in the act, only one thing, nothing else. You are given a piece of paper, a pen, and says change one thing in the act. What would you do?
Radek, you have stolen my question. That was part of my question in the series.
I'm so sorry. I was listening to Veronica and got inspired. I was wondering, like, if she could change one thing, what would be the case?
It is okay, and you'll also get to answer the same question since you took the question off my plate.
And I want to respond before I forget the question. If there was one thing that I would really want to change, if I'm given a pen and a paper, I would change the provisions or the proviso on protection of the victims. Because trust you me, where we have a challenge is the victim, and we will not be able to record successful prosecution if we cannot support the victims to participate in the trial process. That's what I would change first and foremost. Yep.
Thank you.
And that's the Bill of Rights.
Thank you very much. Before you answer the same question, Radek, I'd like to remind our participants to please put in your question on whatever chat box you're using. So whatever platform you're watching us, just put the question in the chat box. They'll get to us. So please feel free to do so, and we'll get to them shortly. So Radek, over to you. If you could change one section of the CTAP Act, which one would it be?
I think I will try to see whether we can implement the mechanisms from the Children's Act that interpret the provisions of the Trafficking Act through the victim's best interest. I think that would make a huge difference if we need to always have in mind the victim's best interest, because sometimes I have a feeling we are lacking that. And as you can see in children, I mean that provision, the what is the best interest for the child, really made big difference in Kenya. And I think we have already tools. We can just borrow it from different law and implement in the Trafficking in Persons Act. Yeah.
That brings me back to a previous question. Do you believe that the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act should be implemented as a standalone document? Because a lot of the times, especially in cases where there's sexual exploitation, instead of looking at the provisions within the Counter-Trafficking Persons Act, most actors go back to the Sexual Offences Act, for example, which tends to have more lenient consequences than the Counter-Trafficking Persons Act. So in your perspective, do you hope for a day where we can look at human trafficking and address the issues with the Counter-Trafficking Persons Act, or do you see a place where we can continue this kind of mix and match of it? I'll start with Veronica since you're unmuted.
Okay, thank you. I would want to say one thing. Do I foresee a situation where we'll apply the Counter-Trafficking in Persons as a standalone law? No. Why? Because the investigators, the prosecutors, the judicial officers, and the lawyers are all trained to apply all these laws and appreciate the provisions in order to safeguard the rights of the victims or the complainant and also the accused persons. So apparently, and unfortunately, I come from a human rights where we believe the accused person has rights, and so is the complainant or the victim, and so is the witness. However, the biggest challenge that we have when it comes to implementation of the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act in Kenya is the fact that not every actor, and especially the investigators, prosecutors, appreciate its contents. And number two, the other challenge that people have is that the threshold of evidence, the burden of proof on counter-trafficking cases is a bit higher compared to sexual offenses, compared to the Penal Code, compared to the Kenya Citizenship and Immigration Act. And no wonder you get this, depending on which officer has arrested a person who is either suspected to be trafficker or a smuggler. And I'm sorry to use those two terminologies. We need to, at some point, we'll have to clarify what those two means. But for the trafficker, they are supposed, if you look at the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act, the traffickers, they have a higher penalty, a very heavy punitive measure is given. But if you are arrested by an investigation officer who cannot or who does not appreciate what the law says and who does not even know how to investigate and what elements to look for them to prove trafficking in persons, then definitely they'll go back to the laws that they know. And there was a lot of awareness creation that was done on Sexual Offences Act. So if it's a woman or a girl who has been trafficked and they're sexually exploited, automatically the officer at the point of arrest will look at the sexual exploitation and fail to work backward. I always say when I'm doing some training on investigations on human trafficking, I always indicate that for human trafficking, At some point, you either work halfway or backward or from the start, because you are likely to get the potential victim of trafficking at the point when they are being recruited. So at that particular point, the only things that you are able to identify is that there was an act. But are you able then to walk through to the exploitation? That then becomes, it was intended. There was intention to exploit. So at that particular point, can the investigator charge this person for trafficking? Of course not. Why? Them proving the means and the purpose. But by virtue of having victims of trafficking, is that at most cases come in, or they are reported to the authorities at the point when the victim is already undergoing exploitation or after undergoing exploitation. So an investigator needs to be empowered to work backward, to identify the exploitation and not stop at it, but rather start asking right questions as to how did you find yourself here, who brought you, where, and so on and so forth. And as they work backward, they're able to then identify the different measures or the criteria that is needed for prosecuting someone for trafficking. So sincerely speaking, we need to do a lot. And also we need to change attitude, because we can do a lot of awareness. But if the individual law enforcement officers are not able to appreciate their role, then it will become a problem to implement the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act. Then, of course, lastly, the individual officers must know their role in protecting the victim of trafficking. Because number one, you're not dealing with any complainant who has just come into court, maybe because they have a breach of contract or because someone assaulted them. You are dealing with someone who has gone through a traumatic incident, and sometimes even getting them to that courtroom requires a lot of attention, psychosocial support. You need to really appreciate who they are and understand how you can protect them, even as you try to get a prosecution. Unfortunately, in Kenyan system, prosecution is, or rather, I don't know how, but this has always been the practice. Prosecution looks at the number of cases prosecuted, not the number of victims supported, unfortunately. And I think this is something that even the prosecutors, if you have any, or even following up, is a conversation where the indicators for results in trial of these cases, even for the judiciary officer, for the judiciary or judicial officers, a number of them, they go with the number of cases tried, number of judgments given, and then where is the person in that process? So you lose the human person in that. So, and this is why when you are speaking about the mainstreaming human rights-based approach in migration governance, in all these prosecution judicial services, we try to bring in the component of, can you see the human being in that process? So that then we should then start asking ourselves, now that prosecution is so focused on number of prosecution, number of successful and failed trials and so on, can we then have entities like Victims Protection Agency taking up their role of protecting the victims and doing so properly? Can we have, under the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act, the trust fund coming in with different measures and have some of those proposals in our Counter-Trafficking Amendment Act or bill, where then we say for victims of.
Sorry, Veronica, you've muted yourself. Veronica.
Sorry, there was a call that was coming in. This is the challenge of dealing with a phone for webinar. Sorry for that. I want to bar that call. There is need for us to appreciate that we should not lose the victim and the person in the process. Because the moment you lose the person, then you will never see the person who is being assisted, and your number of prosecution or your number of successful judgment and so on may not necessarily change the humanity or the human that we are trying to change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica, and thank you for pushing through despite the interruptions. Radek, you have a strong perspective on protection, and you've worked with a lot of victims over the years that you've worked in Kenya on human trafficking. Do you see, or have you seen, based on your experience, do most victims prefer or opt for justice in actually going to the courts and going through the criminal justice system, or do more look at justice in a different perspective? And if they do, what do they consider justice to them?
Well, I will try to answer that question to the best of my ability. I don't work directly with victims, our organization does. But I think to answer this question, we need to understand that our system that enables you to seek justice is often complex, and victims often find it extremely difficult to maneuver in that system. And that is another question that we need to raise. To what extent we as civil society, or we as a legal society in Kenya, will provide a platform for victims to seek their justice. Okay, so my experience would be that most of the cases no, unless they feel that that will protect the victims. But I think the underlying problem is that victims don't feel comfortable in the justice sector. You know, like they don't find it easy to seek legal justice. And what does it mean to seek justice? Of course, to receive some compensation, to restore, to look for restorative kind of justice, I guess less for the retributive one, but mainly to restore what was damaged by human trafficking. And sometimes you cannot restore the damage, but you can pay for it. You know, like you cannot bring back the number of days, or even months, or even years that you stole from somebody by forcing him to work in an exploitative way, but you can pay for it. And I think we should do more to focus on people being responsible for the trafficking process. You know, well, as you know, we mentioned that human trafficking is a process, so the process starts somewhere, and you can have individual responsibilities for recruiting, for transporting, or for exploiting people. So if we can't put these people into criminal responsibility, maybe we can think about some form of compensation that can be given to victims. As I'm saying, the ideal is situations that we can restore the damage. If we can restore the damage, let the culprits pay for the damage. And I think if we focus on that, on the civil part of restoring the damage, I would say that we can have a better implementation of the law.
That's a really good perspective, and I know that the Counter-Trafficking Persons Act had actually envisioned that, and the Victim Assistance Trust Fund is supposed to be funded also by the benefits of by the cartels or by the criminals who are benefiting from this exploitation. So their profits or their income was supposed to also go into the funding of the Victim Assistance Trust Fund. So I think that's as Veronica has said, we also need to remember that we need to see the human being. So look beyond the processes and the statistics on prosecution and so on, and look at, is the human being whole after this? If not, how can we help them get from this point of trauma to the point where they're kind of getting on with their lives, even if, as you've mentioned, days, months, or even years have been taken away from them. Again, to our audience, please remember to put in your questions in whatever platform you're watching us from, and the questions will get to us. We have an amazing team behind the scenes. For now, I'll go to some of the questions. We have one directly to from Naima Mungai, directly to Veronica. How do we separate cultural biases in how the law is applied specifically, especially to victims who've been trafficked for sex in Kenya? Veronica? Oh,
Wow. You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. And now you're on the hot seat again.
Hey.
I've had that wow, so I know you're on the hot seat again.
Oh yeah, you said wow, and I was worried. I thought maybe I had gone off. Okay, thank you, Naima. One thing, when you talk of when you ask how can we approach cases of persons who are trafficked for sexual exploitation, and try to remove the bias in it in terms of the approach, I would first and foremost want to appreciate, are you looking at it from the culture that if you come across a victim of trafficking who was sexually exploited, there is a tendency of blame game. And I think this is also a cultural aspect where the person or the victim is looked at as if you knew what you are going to do, you are in control, you could have done something. And I'm sorry, this is, yes, that's what you mean. Thank you, Naima. So unfortunately, we are in a culture that is more of patriarchal. And I think coming from years of patriarchy and so on, unfortunately, even today, you'd hear cases of defilement, cases of rape, where a woman goes to court or even goes to report to the police station, and the first appreciation is that the way you address, no wonder, unfortunately. Those are some of the comments that were coming in. But it took a lot of awareness, it took a lot of sensitization, and also a few cases of individual officers being taken to book to account as to why did you not take up this case, why was your approach, and so on. So the need for us to really appreciate that. So how can we really change that attitude? I think we start with one, awareness creation. Two, ensuring that even as we converse about human trafficking, let us not lose a person in it. Whether it is a woman, whether it is a man, we are now having trends where it is a male who are also being trafficked in some different parts of our countries. So the question is it easier for a man to be trafficked, or is it easier for a woman to be trafficked? So we really need to start working and ask ourselves, we have a responsibility as an officer who is charged with
I think Veronica has gotten another call, so we'll move on to the next question. Oh,
sorry, discriminating.
Okay.
Otherwise, for any of, feel free to report to the Kenya National Commission for Human. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. So I was just concluding and saying, should you come across a case of someone who is approaching or applying the law in a manner that is discriminative, then feel free to reach out to the National Commission, because part of our work is to help them change their attitude. And where we feel we need them to work with them on that. But in terms of even addressing the case of human trafficking, we need to empower everyone to understand sexual exploitation, whether it is for removal of organ, whether it is for cheap labor, exploitation is exploitation. So long as in the human trafficking cases, we are able to follow through the acts, the means, and the purpose, then should be similar and should cut across from the investigation to the prosecution to the judicial officers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Veronica, you're on the hot seat again. The next question again is from Naima, and her question is there any plan by the government to work on civic education in all counties in the county legal and policies to ensure protection of victims? Do we have a plan on that?
Thank you. Is my background noisy? Let me ask that.
No, your background is not noisy. We can hear you very well.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm somewhere. Okay, thank you. So let me respond to Naima again. Naima, thank you so much. What is the plan by government? Number one, I alluded to the fact that the government currently is working with the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Secretariat and also the National Coordination Mechanism. We have a coordination mechanism on migration in Kenya called NCM. And these are the different platforms that are being brought about to coordinate with the civil society organization and start civic education in the different counties. Unfortunately, limited funding is a reality on matters human trafficking. And number two, it is not a priority. So it is some of these discussions that we are having with the different actors will help us to create the dialogue and empower everyone to appreciate that these cases of human trafficking are a reality. They are affecting Kenya, and whether one Kenyan is affected, whether one migrant in Kenya is affected, then we have the honors and responsibility to prioritize. So true, there is a plan, but I wouldn't say like a plan for next week or next year, no. But I think from our end at Kenya National Commission, we are really increasing our fundraising efforts toward supporting regional conversation. So far, we've been able to do a lot of regional conversation with the court users committees and the human rights defenders and some civil society in the region. But have we been able to do so much in terms of reaching to the communities? No, we haven't. We still have a gap there. Thank you.
Sorry, Veronica, before you go, there's a follow-up question on that with regard to the national referral mechanism. Could we, the question is on the fact that it's still a very beautiful document that has not been implemented. Could we attribute this lack of awareness on it, on the fact that the information is still at national level and not county level? And could this be an avenue for victim protection? Yeah, if it's well implemented, could this be an avenue for victim protection in all counties within the country?
Thank you. So 2 things about the NRM. The National Referral Mechanism guidelines are very good in that they help us to identify a victim of trafficking, and they help us to coordinate a referral mechanism for assistance. Unfortunately, the document, as you say, is still a good document, very comprehensive, and I like it. But very soon we'll of course have the NRM being put up in an online basis, and we are hoping it will also help capture the different service providers at the different regional levels. This is one way of empowering our different actors, the CBOs, the FBOs in the communities, to start appreciating what services and what it is they can offer to victims of trafficking. However, when you look at the reality of the NRM, is that when the national referral mechanisms guidelines were developed and launched, that is in 2018, if I'm not wrong, we did so much at the national level, and with a few key actors on human trafficking. We did not delve into the ministries that have an angle on migration or matters human trafficking. We also did not bother to speak so much about in the counties. However, I understand that the Department of Children Services disseminated a few copies in different counties through their county children officers. So the question then again we come back to ask is, we still have a long way to go. So for us to make the document a living document, we need to prioritize dissemination and implementation, because you cannot just disseminate. Giving me a copy of document and stopping at that may not help me, but helping me to pilot it, helping me to implement it is an area that you can work closely and focus. And I know GIZ BMM has been discussing on how to support the civil society organization, the consortium, as well as the government actors, on how we can then get deeper and pilot even some of these NRM and see what is going on. So very soon, I think I will also be communicating about the directory that we are going to put up at Kenya National. We are borrowing largely from the NRM, and we are believing that because of our mandate on human rights and the fact that we want to bring the conversation of the human in the human trafficking process, we are going to bring up the directory online, and we of course will be having a lot of conversation thereon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. I'll take a pause on the questions and ask one of mine to Radek. Both of you have mentioned extensively different stakeholders. You've mentioned CSOs, you've mentioned government, you've mentioned multiple stakeholders with regards to this conversation. Do you, if you had a wish list of the stakeholders you'd want to work with to ensure the proper implementation of the Counter-Trafficking Persons Act, who would be your primary stakeholders, and what role do you believe they would play in this partnership?
Well, that's a tricky question. Of course, we would like to work with Veronica, obviously, that's the number one stakeholder. We like to and Kenya National Commission of Human Rights. But I think, like, to answer that question properly, we need to understand what is the nature of counter-trafficking law. And like any like any country, I guess, in the world, the issue of a crime, because human trafficking is a crime, yes? It is not, it's not something else, it's a crime. And for any criminal conduct, the person or the institution that is in charge is the government that is channeling its policies against this particular crime through certain institutions. So even if you want to choose to work with somebody, and that means that you don't want to work with somebody else, in the end, who is like the main player here is the government of the current place, which in our case it is government of Kenya. And the law is always putting a government in the position of being the most responsible institution that also is given a job of coordinating the creation of the law against human trafficking, evaluation of the law, and above all, coordination of the all counter trafficking aspects. And you can't get away from that. And I think that is right now the most important thing to, first of all, to recognize that role and to appreciate it, but also to expect that from the government, that we need the government to be really in charge and in coordination of the mechanisms that are provided by the Act. And just to maybe add a few more ideas, I believe like our role as the CSOs is to provide support, you know, that to kind of to fit into that framework, to provide support, to advocate for that support, to provide some services. But when it comes to coordination and implementation, I guess we can be on the advisory level, no more than that. And well, so I understand that the current framework that we have gives us specifically whom we should work with, and well, we have to work with those organizations and those institutions, and we can only expect that that collaboration will be fruitful for us and for them, and above all for the victims of trafficking.
Thank you very much. Veronica, I see you smiling and nodding again, so I'll ask you to also add on to that.
If I nod, then I'm agreeing with the Radek, what he says. Of course, the criminal aspect of it, we cannot wish it away. So the law enforcement agencies are very crucial in this conversation. But of course, we also need to go beyond the traditional criminal justice actors. And if you, for instance, look at what we have been doing as Kenya National Commission for Human Rights, the conversation we have started currently with the justice actors, we started going, one, we have brought in the civil society organization on the table. They sit across the table with the judicial officers, the ODPP, that is prosecution officials, the law enforcement, that is the police, the CIDs. Well, the reason for that is to ensure that all these different stakeholders are able to add value, and we want to insist on a multi-sectoral approach. And the reason for this being, if you then bring in all these stakeholders and have them give you the perspective, you will find that a case will be easily prosecuted to the end without a lot of delays as to when a certain office or a certain officer is struggling to answer a question of either protection or a question of evidence or a question of what service can I give at this point. And I'll give an example. When you have a person who is trafficked, a victim of trafficking, for instance, and maybe let's say it's a young girl, for instance, 14 years old, and they've been sexually exploited. It's easy for someone to just say they are in the process and they are just coming in as victims. But a psychologist will tell you something else. An investigator will look at the facts. Psychology will look at the well-being mentally. Will also look at the psychosocial support that is required. A human rights person will look at the rights of this person. A judicial officer will look at the access to justice and the evidence in order for them to deliver a ruling or a judgment that is favorable to the victim and safeguard the rights. While on the other side, a civil society organization in the question will be looking at the value addition to the process. If this person is put up in a shelter, what care, what protection are we providing amongst others? So I think all actors are very relevant, but of course, because you say prioritization, of course, the police. If we do proper investigation, everything else can be worked upon as we go up, or as we get into the deeper situations of the evidence, among others. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you. And based on your answers, I believe we have kind of a direction after this conversation. Veronica, you reminded us that we have to create awareness. And since we both, you both agree that law enforcement should be well empowered on issues on the Counter-Trafficking Persons Act, now we have kind of an assignment. We should actively target law enforcement actors and see how we can empower them beyond the two units, the Anti-Human Trafficking Child Protection Unit and the Transnational Organized Crime Unit. So from me to you, that's an assignment and a challenge, like for you to actually take this upon your organization, yourselves and your organization. We have another question, which is, there's a lot of misinformation that ties to human trafficking, especially when it comes to organ harvesting and sexual trafficking. What can be done to counter it so that it doesn't undermine the stories from victims and survivors? I will ask Radek to answer that first, and then Veronica, same question. So Radek?
Well, I mean, what do we need? What do we need is that we need to now go beyond the current kind of like the current scenario where often we operate on some myths, you know, and that's what happens in many countries. It's not only Kenya that has this problem. Many countries in Africa, but also beyond Africa, they have similar problem that people, they have some ideas in the head about what is human trafficking. For example, in the whenever you get any policies from the Western world, you will always associate human trafficking with sexual exploitation because that's the #1 problem in the developed world. But if you go beyond that, you realize that forced labor, child labor is also at least equally a problem, if not more, than sexual exploitation. Then you have other forms of human trafficking that exist, and those forms they sometimes they never cross people's minds when it comes to human trafficking. Why? Because often we think human trafficking is going abroad, or human trafficking is about sexual exploitation of women, or human trafficking never happens inside Kenya, or human trafficking is mainly for children when they are trafficked for child labor. Those are myths and they're not helping, and we need to move. We need to move beyond them. I guess there are some practical steps. We need to somehow decide we want to get rid. We need to be more professional in the approach, because only professional approach will provide enough protection for the victims. I guess there's no other way. I mean, victims will be always exposed to secondary victimization. There will be always, their rights will be always neglected, if not abused, if you don't have that professional approach that is based on the law, on practice, and also on international human rights standards. What can we do? Very simple. Provide a very simple guide to each police station. Don't give them like a book that has 50 pages. Nobody will read it. They are too busy. I mean, our police service is too busy for that. Like, you know, even a poster on that should be put on the wall is enough. It would make a difference. So they know what does the common kind of like symptoms of somebody being trafficked and what to do. Okay, and then maybe give like 2 or 4 pages story about other cases of trafficking that can be such simple things can make a big difference. Of course, introducing this to extensive training to different law enforcement, different people who are coming to meet human trafficking victims. Those who are coming, they should be told what to do when they come across. And I believe through increase of professional approach, we are going to have a better protection of victims' rights. And in the end, we mentioned before the awareness. It is a good tool to create a better kind of like a system to prevent victims from being further exploited and being protected. But we need to ask ourselves the question, like, if we create awareness, what people are going to do with that awareness? What kind of like, how do we channel the knowledge and skills that we give on at the community level? We need to, in other words, the institutions, organizations, people who are likely to respond to human trafficking, they need to also participate in that awareness so they can channel the cases through a proper system. And unfortunately, so far, we are struggling with that. Remember, Kenya is not Nairobi. We have to, if you go outside Nairobi, you will see that often this is a challenge, and we need to address, we need to create a system that will be, efficiently provide the response to human trafficking.
I like that about Nairobi, because a lot of the conversations have limited to Nairobi. And after we've had a successful meeting with actors in Nairobi, we believe, and maybe it goes back to what Veronica had mentioned, that as a big challenge nationally, on not only on human trafficking, but on multiple, like the whole aspect of it. So maybe, hopefully, as we improve, trafficking can also trickle down to different counties as well. Veronica, same question. Your thoughts on misinformation, especially on organ trafficking and sex trafficking?
Just to concur with what Radek has said, there's a lot of misinformation. One, because also of our culture and where we come from. And when I say where we come from, I'm trying to say, like, we have almost, I think, 46 or 47 communities or tribes in Kenya. And each of these tribes, they have their culture. And they have a way they connote or they perceive some of these things. So sometimes you'd even get, when you're talking about human trafficking for purposes of removal of organs or other organ transplants, people most of the time don't look at it as a big thing. Instead, I think we go back into witchcraft mentality. We also go back into, whatever is happening is something else and not necessarily the law. And I think it's up to us, for instance, to create a lot of awareness, as Radek has said. Let us create awareness to the different actors, but also to the communities. Remember, it is the communities who are gatekeepers. When they come across a child who has either been, who is a victim of trafficking and has gone through some of those incidents, allow me to call that, the community will report the case. How they report will then give an angle to the investigator's perspective. So yes, we need to do a lot of awareness creation. I really support the agenda of coming up with a simple messaging posters, which can be placed in the chiefs local administration offices, those signboards, in the church signboards, and also the police station. And even in the migration border point, I'm just appreciating that these are some of the areas where the communities would come across this messaging and can really influence the fight against human trafficking in Kenya. Then on another note, we also need to work beyond the child protection unit and the anti-trafficking unit within the DCI. They are very, very good in terms of the stakeholders, but unfortunately, they are based in the head office. So the question then you want to ask yourself is, for a child who is being trafficked in Taita today, how will they come into contact with the law? Obviously, the children officer on the ground, or the civil society organization on the ground, or the judiciary the station on the ground, or the judiciary or the judicial officer on the ground, and the police on the ground. So again, the need for us to move the conversation from the headquarters, that is Nairobi, and let us go to the mashinani. Let us go to where Wanjiko is, because this is where a lot of violations are happening with regard to child trafficking and human trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you both. You have continued the conversation for a while now, and we're almost at the end of our allotted time. So I'll ask you for your parting shot as we conclude today's conversation, and also as we conclude our Know Better, Do Better campaign. As we mentioned at the start, this is our last session. So I'll start with Veronica and then go to Radek, because technically we have been hosting the campaign thanks to Hart and also Radek. So I'll let him give a vote of thanks as he gives his parting shot. So Veronica.
Thank you. First, Michelle, thank you so much for the moderation. Thank you, Heart Kenya, for giving us this opportunity. And I would want, first and foremost, on my own behalf as Veronica, the advocate, and again, on my behalf as a Veronica,
I'm sure Veronica is joining us shortly. She's probably hanging up the call.
just a minute, 1 minute from Commission on Human Rights. I want to thank Heart Kenya for this opportunity, everyone who was listening to what human trafficking is all about. And as we appreciate the act, the means, and the purpose, the different elements for the adult trafficking and the act and the purpose for the child, let us not forget the person in it. And always don't hold the conversation of human trafficking as a conversation of they versus us. It is about us, it is about you, and you have a role. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, especially for joining us despite your busy schedule. Based on the interruptions we've had, I know myself and also Heart are very grateful that you're able to take the time despite your busy schedule. So thank you very much. Over to you, Radek. And yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Michelle. And I must say you are very modest because, I mean, this whole campaign, it was also organized not only by Heart, but also in collaboration with STTK coalition. So I think we need to also give credit to you and the whole movement for supporting this, I believe, very important idea of sharing about human trafficking online. Special thanks to Veronica as well for attending and availing herself on this specific date. I think it was great to have you with us and give us a very important perspective from the human rights activist. Well, human trafficking, as you know, like we call that campaign "Know Better, Do Better." Well, it's because it's one of the few problems we have around the world that knowledge actually makes immediate difference. You know, like it doesn't happen that often. Yeah? We look at climate change. We know that climate change is changing and actually is affecting us, but there's so much kind of like reluctance to do something, or sometimes we are often stuck with implementing some changes into the climate change policies. But for human trafficking is much simpler. I mean, if you know, then knowledge is going to make a difference. And that's why that's how this campaign came, because we believe the knowledge makes a difference. But the question is, we need to have that knowledge at the community level. That's why we appreciate all the people that decided to join us. First of all, we appreciate our partners who organized the whole campaign. We appreciate the panelists who agreed to share the knowledge on this matter. And also appreciate the people who agreed to join and listen to us and share the ideas, ask questions, share the experience, because that is what is building the knowledge, you know, the knowledge that will eventually make Kenya a trafficking-free country. I believe I will still be alive when this will happen, and I'm not planning to live that long, because I think human trafficking can be eradicated from our society, and I think it is the job for our generation that somehow it happened that we need to strongly say no. And I believe that sharing knowledge is one of the best ways to say no to human trafficking. And hopefully that will be one of the most practical outcomes of these webinars, that we will contribute significantly to the knowledge that will in terms contribute to eradication of human trafficking. So one more time, thank you to our partners, thank you to the donors who enable us to organize that, thank you to DK and other donors, and thank you to all the participants. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I believe I get the opportunity to say thank you to everyone for joining us for one last time, and I look forward to having you join other activities by Heart throughout this week and next week in honor of the World Day Against Trafficking Persons, which is 30th July. We'll also have a few members of Stop the Traffic who will have activities next week So keep your eye out for all these activities next week. I know the Kenya National Commission might also have activities, and the Counter-Trafficking Persons Secretariat and Advisory Committee. So in case you still have questions on all that we've talked about in the last few weeks, feel free to look at any of our platforms, because next week will be a week full of very many activities on human trafficking. So again, thank you very much and have an amazing
Thank you, and have a nice the rest of the afternoon. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.